There are only two genders. You ever heard this? Maybe you believe this yourself. Let's break it down. Today we're going to be talking about three things. We're going to be talking about the difference between gender and sex, what gender actually is, and why it can be useful for your mental health. My name is Sean. I'm a mental health coach. I see 40 plus clients a week, and the average client that works with me sees a 67% increase in clarity in their life. A lot of people use the terms gender and sex interchangeably, but they are actually distinct. So sex is biological and gender is cultural. Oftentimes when people say there are only two genders, they say men have penises and women have vaginas. And what they are actually talking about is biological sex. But even within biological sex, there are more than two. Sure, male and female are the two most common, but there is actually a whole spectrum of different genitalia combinations and XY chromosome combinations that make up the full spectrum of sex within human beings. And if we are actually talking about gender, it is ultimately a construct. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not important. Things like money and time are both constructs. All that it means is that it only has meaning because we give it meaning. So for instance, with money, ultimately, it's just a piece of paper. It has no actual value or use. The only reason that it has value and use is because a whole bunch of people in a given society got together and said, we all agree that this means something to us and that we can exchange it for things that actually do have value. Or with time, we have all agreed that there is a calendar with 12 months and a set amount of days within each of those months. But ultimately, that is completely arbitrary. And in fact, some other cultures run by different calendars. And with gender, it is a construct about the individual, a decision that feels right to them. Ultimately, there can be as many genders as there are people to create them. To say that there are only two is sort of like saying that USD is the only currency. Sure, you can say that, but there are huge swaths of people that all agree that this, Russian franc or whatever is an alternative currency and are exchanging that currency in the real world. Now, gender and sex do definitely intermingle. So for instance, if somebody is born with a penis, we will assign them male at birth, that is sex, and then we will often socialize them as a boy, as a man, and that is gender. And this is true of society in general, especially Western society, that we tend to work in averages. So, for instance, the gold standard in science is a double-blind randomized controlled trial, where we test a huge population of people, and based on what we find, let's say, for example, this drug effectively treats these symptoms in 80% of people, we will say, okay, for those symptoms, this is an effective drug to use to treat those symptoms. And what that means is that for those other 20% of people, that drug was not very effective in treating their symptoms. But we sort of dismiss that because we are working on these broad averages. And I see this with people that I work with all the time. For so many people, the pre-made paths of life just don't fit quite right. And in trying to follow them, they wind up miserable. And where I see them find a lot of fulfillment and freedom is when they start to homebrew their own version of life that feels good to them. And gender is a huge part of that equation. Gender is ultimately a spectrum. So you can sort of think about it like sizes of clothes. For clothes, we have small, medium, large, etc. But there is actually a whole spectrum in between each of those sizes. And for most of us, if we want something to fit us perfectly, we either have to have it tailored or custom made, because most of us don't actually fit perfectly into those pre-made sizes. And it's the same with gender. I view gender as three distinct spectrums, and there are people that encompass a whole lot more within gender than what I'm going to include here, and ultimately it's a construct, so that's great. I say that to clarify that this model is not definitive, it's just the way that is helpful, that has been helpful for me to think about gender. So let me show you. So these are the three distinct spectrums. So as a man, you can lean masculine, feminine, or neutral. Either, somewhere in the middle, or you just don't care. You just don't feel strongly toward gender in either way. You can identify as a woman, and you can lean masculine, feminine, or again, neutral. And you can be non-binary, and you can lean masculine, feminine, or neutral. So for instance, if you're a tomboy, you're a woman that leans a little bit more masculine. Some people opt out of the gender construct entirely. They just dismiss the concept entirely and choose to go about life without engaging in that construct. And then there are other people that are gender fluid, which, from my perspective, means that they sort of bounce in between the different spectrums. So on one day, they may feel like a masculine man, and on another day, they may feel like a feminine woman, or a masculine woman, or a feminine man. And sometimes people will even occupy multiple places on the spectrum at once. That's one of the things that is so beautiful about the human mind, is that we have the capacity to hold two seemingly conflictual things true at once. And remember, because gender is a construct, what masculine, feminine, neutral mean in any given culture is going to vary widely. So for instance, in some cultures, it's very masculine for men to wear skirts. And that is not true in American Western culture. And being aware of where you fall on these spectrums can be really fulfilling, just like, wearing clothes that fit you perfectly. And the other thing about this is that just because you choose a point on this spectrum doesn't mean that you have to commit to it forever. So just like somebody that is gender fluid can, jump between spectrums and occupy multiple points on the spectrum at any given time, you too can sort of change where you want to sit on the spectrum as you go through your life. And it doesn't invalidate the original journey that you went on with gender in the beginning. But ultimately, the little dot on the spectrum only matters with how you choose to embody and express it. So that might, be expressed in clothing that you wear. It might be expressed in how you speak, how you hold yourself, how you walk. There are all sorts of different ways that you can choose to express your own gender identity. And ultimately, that's going to be a personal journey for you. So how can knowing where you are on these spectrums have some sort of impact on you, your life, your mental health? Well, to use myself as an example, I always felt unattractive when I was younger, and I would try to dress in the sort of masculine man attractive way, things like suits and stuff like that. And I always felt unattractive. It never felt like it fit me. And as I discovered that I lean more as sort of a feminine man on the spectrum, I realized that I still remember when I put on my first sort of outfit that felt like a feminine man's outfit, I remember how attractive I felt for the first time in my life. I'd never felt attractive before. And all of a sudden, I actually felt attractive. It felt really good. Some of my interests are also sort of traditionally feminine. So, for instance, I like skincare. I like talking about feelings. I like watching people dance. And I also have interests that lean more traditionally masculine. So I'm really interested in business, and I get a lot of fulfillment from providing for my wife. And personally, I don't care what other people identify me as because I feel secure in my own gender identity. So oftentimes people think that I'm gay or trans, and I get it. Based on the societal constructs, it is reasonable to assume that I would fall into one of those categories. So I don't blame them for lumping me into them. And ultimately, these constructs can be useful. It is nice to be able to go clothes shopping online and know that I need to buy a small. I think that the problem comes when these constructs become rigid. So, for instance, let's take an example of a man that growing up was always told, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. And, when he reached out for support because he was really struggling, he was met with things like, you have no right to complain, you're a man, suck it up, you're so privileged, why are you complaining? And so then when he sees someone else who is breaking outside of these constructs that he has always felt forced to adhere to, makes a lot of sense that that would feel really unfair and make him feel angry. Now, to be very clear, I'm not saying that justifies any sort of violent or hateful behavior. I think that people still need to be held accountable for their behavior. But there is a big, big difference between behavior and emotions, because emotions are always valid. It makes perfect sense that he would feel angry about, him being held to this standard and this other person not being held to this standard. But the behavior may not be acceptable that accompanies that. And I think that if we are to do the gender healing that seems necessary in our society, then we really need to start understanding the nuance between these two things, that emotions are always valid, actions are not. So here are some things to reflect on if any of this resonated with you. Where do I fall on the different gender spectrums? Just, you can go back in the video and take a screenshot of the gender spectrums and just find sort of where you fall. How do I/could I embody that in my life? Again, how do you move? How do you dress? How do you speak? Do I feel held back or inhibited by any gender constructs? So are there ways that, like the man who feels like he can't express his feelings, has been sort of, lumped into this man box that has to be tough all the time? Are there ways that you feel inhibited by the gender constructs that surround you? And finally, how could I take a baby step outside of that construct to find more fulfillment for myself? So again, in my example, one of the ways that I did that was in the way that I dressed. I started dressing in a more sort of androgynous, gender gray kind of way, and that was really fulfilling for me. And by the way, if you feel very happy and comfortable in your gender identity without doing any sort of work on it, then that's great. Keep being you. If you'd like help exploring the nuances of your own gender identity, I'll leave a link down in the description for a free 50-minute session with me. Black and white thinking is an indication of fight or flight response, which is something that comes up when we feel unsafe. And so I think that the more that we are able to embrace nuance and subtlety, the more that we will be able to heal. And if this exploration of gender identity is something that seems interesting, valuable, useful to you, this video goes into detail about empowered women and emotionally intelligent men. It'll either pop up here or down in the description. Hope that helps, and I'll see you next time. Bye!